Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now, let's dive into the stories.
At the end of February, a group of friends decided to venture into the mountains for a weekend getaway. They were eager to escape the daily grind and recharge in the peace and quiet of nature. The group, all university classmates, had been close for years, but as they grew older, their paths diverged. This trip was supposed to reconnect them. The mountains they were headed to were known for their breathtaking views, but also for their treacherous nature. The forested slopes, covered in deep snow, created an illusion of isolation, as though the world outside didn't exist. From the moment they arrived, it was clear that they were about to experience something far removed from their usual busy lives. They snapped a few photos against the towering peaks before beginning the climb up one of the highest accessible summits. By evening they had set up camp by a remote lake. The air was crisp and a thick fog had begun to roll in from the valley, slowly enveloping everything in its path. They sat around a crackling fire, chatting about their past adventures until Alex, one of the friends, began telling a chilling tale. It was a local legend, one he had heard from an old hiker. Years ago, a group of explorers had gone missing on the very mountain they were now climbing. No trace of them had ever been found, not even footprints. The locals believed that the mountain was cursed, that there was something in the fog, something that watched travelers and led them astray. Everyone laughed it off, dismissing it as superstition. But the strange fog that surrounded them, growing denser by the minute, made them uneasy. That night, after a few drinks, they retired to their tents. But at around 2 a.m., one of them, Ethan, woke with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. He sat up in his tent, heart racing, feeling like something was wrong. There was a strange stillness outside, no wind, no animals, just the eerie quiet of the mountains. He decided to step outside to investigate. What he saw made his blood run cold. A shadow, fast-moving and without form, crossed in front of him as if something was slipping in and out of the fog. He blinked and the shadow was gone, but a soft, whispering sound lingered in the air. Ethan quickly returned to his tent and tried to convince himself it was nothing, just the mountain playing tricks on him. But when he tried to sleep again, the whispering grew louder, almost like voices calling his name. He woke the others, his voice trembling as he recounted what he had seen. Some of the group tried to dismiss it, but the tension in the air was palpable. The fog was no longer just a natural occurrence, it felt alive as if it were moving closer, encircling them. They decided to pack up and head back down the mountain, but the weather was worsening, and the trail down had disappeared beneath a heavy blanket of snow. The next morning they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was a strange and unsettling discovery. The cabin seemed to have been left suddenly, the windows covered with what looked like ancient, faded markings. Inside, the walls were adorned with strange symbols and drawings, some in languages none of them could recognize. It felt like a relic from another time, something that didn't belong in the world they knew. As the day wore on, a sense of paranoia set in. They could no longer deny that something was wrong. Every sound seemed amplified in the eerie silence, and they felt as if they were being watched. But every time they tried to explore the area, there was nothing to be found. No wildlife, no other hikers. Just the oppressive fog, now thicker than ever. The tension reached its peak as they sat inside the cabin that night, trying to sleep. Ethan kept hearing voices outside the cabin, faint murmurs in the wind. He stepped outside to investigate, but all he found was more fog, thick as a wall, blocking his vision. The temperature had dropped drastically, and the air felt heavy like it was pushing down on them. As the hours passed, they realized they couldn't escape. The fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon, it was something more sinister, something that had trapped them. And whatever had been watching them from the beginning seemed to be drawing closer. That night, they made a decision. They would descend the mountain at first light, no matter what. But the mountain had other plans. As they gathered their gear, they noticed something strange, footprints in the snow. But they weren't theirs. The footprints led away from the cabin toward the summit. Fear set in as they realized they weren't alone in these mountains. And the more they tried to leave, the deeper they were pulled into its grip. The true horror of the mountains wasn't just the weather or the isolation. It was something far older, something that had been waiting for travelers like them. As the group followed the strange footprints, they unknowingly stepped closer to the truth. But what awaited them on that summit was a secret better left buried, one that no one could ever leave without paying the price. The group, shaken and uneasy, decided to follow the strange footprints in the snow, which seemed to lead toward the summit. The thought of staying in the cabin another night was unbearable, and they figured it was their only option. Perhaps they'd find a way off the mountain. Or at least an answer to the strange occurrences they had already experienced. As they made their way up, the fog grew thicker, swallowing everything around them. Visibility was now so poor that they could barely see each other, let alone the landscape ahead. The cold was biting, and the air felt unnaturally still, as if the very mountain was holding its breath. "We should turn back," suggested Sarah, one of the more cautious members of the group, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." But Alex, the most determined of them all, pressed on. "We've come this far. We're not turning back now. We'll find something at the top, answers maybe. Something that makes sense of all this." The footprints led them higher and higher, winding around jagged rocks and through dense patches of snow. The air grew thinner, harder to breathe. It felt like the mountain was resisting them. The journey that should have taken a few hours dragged on, and they began to feel as though they were walking in circles, the same snow-covered trees and cliffs appearing over and over again. Eventually they reached a clearing. In the center, half buried in snow, stood an ancient stone altar. The sight of it stopped them dead in their tracks. The altar was covered in strange, weathered symbols, similar to those they had seen inside the cabin. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in centuries, yet there was something eerie about it, like it had never truly been abandoned. Ethan approached the altar cautiously, his instincts telling him to stay away, but his curiosity overpowering his fear. As his fingers brushed the surface, he felt a strange warmth, almost as if the stone had been heated by something unseen. The warmth sent a shiver down his spine. He backed away quickly, but as he did, he noticed something even more unsettling, a figure standing just beyond the clearing, barely visible through the fog. It was a person, no, not a person, but something human-like, though distorted. The figure stood perfectly still, its eyes locked on them. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the mist. "Did anyone else see that?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "See what?" Sarah asked, her face pale as she glanced around, but there was nothing there. Only the thick fog and the oppressive silence. "I'm not going crazy," Ethan insisted. "There was someone there. I swear it." They huddled together, anxiety rising. Alex was the first to speak. "We need to find out what's going on. We're not leaving until we know." Suddenly, the ground beneath them rumbled, a low, ominous sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The fog swirled violently, and a gust of wind cut through the clearing, forcing them to shield their faces. When the wind subsided, they saw something truly terrifying, more figures, emerging from the mist, their faces obscured, their movements jerky and unnatural. The figures didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to chill the group to the core. It was as though they were trapped in some sort of twisted ritual, a forgotten ceremony that had been waiting for unsuspecting souls to wander into its grasp. "Run!" Alex shouted, his voice filled with panic. But as they turned to flee, the fog seemed to close in on them, and the ground beneath their feet shifted. The mountain was no longer just a place, they were in the midst of something far darker, something that wasn't bound by the laws of nature. The group scrambled, trying to find their way back to the cabin, but the fog disoriented them. Every direction seemed the same, the landscape shifting in strange, impossible ways. The figures were still there, following them, always just out of reach, their presence looming in the background like a shadow they could never escape. By the time they reached what they thought was the cabin again, it had changed. It no longer stood as they remembered. It was now a ruin, its walls crumbling, the windows shattered, and the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, and the symbols on the walls had changed, becoming more sinister, more desperate. "Where are we?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't the same place." But it was. The cabin had transformed, perhaps in time, perhaps in their minds. The fog had twisted their perception, warped their reality. Something ancient and powerful had awoken, and it was using them to complete an old, unfinished task. Ethan stumbled into a corner of the cabin, his eyes fixed on a dark shape in the shadows. Slowly the shape took form, an old journal, its pages yellowed with age, covered in the same strange symbols they had seen everywhere. As he opened it, he saw that it was filled with the names of people who had disappeared over the years, each name followed by the same eerie words. They became the mist. "Wait," Ethan murmured, his voice shaky. This is what's happening to us. We're becoming part of it. Part of the mountain." The realization hit them like a wave of ice water. They weren't just lost. They were being consumed. Slowly but surely, they were becoming a part of the very thing they had come to uncover, a twisted fate sealed long ago by the mountain's cursed history. As the fog closed in around them once more, they understood. There would be no escape. The mountain had claimed them just as it had claimed countless others before. And they too would fade into the mist. The realization hit them with an almost unbearable weight. The mountain wasn't just trapping them, it was slowly consuming their very essence, as if the mist itself had a hunger that could never be satisfied. Ethan, clutching the journal with trembling hands, tried to make sense of the words that seemed to scrawl across the ancient pages, but they were indecipherable, slipping through his thoughts like smoke. His fingers traced the names, and as he did, he felt an unsettling sensation, like the words were pulling him in, as if the ink on the paper was alive, binding him to something far worse than mere death. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" Alex, who had been pacing back and forth, his mind racing, suddenly stopped and turned to face the group. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, unnervingly calm for the situation they were in. "We get out," he said, his tone sharp, but it lacked the certainty he was trying to convey. "We have to leave. We can't stay here." But even as he said it, he knew it was futile. Every instinct screamed at him that there was no leaving now. The mountain had marked them, and there was nothing they could do to reverse what had already begun. The temperature inside the cabin dropped sharply, and the fog outside seemed to thicken, as though it were pushing inward, closing the door on their escape. The whispers, soft at first, were now louder, crawling into their ears like insects. The mist outside seemed to pulsate, a living thing. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, drawing their attention. Heavy and deliberate, the steps grew louder and closer. But no one was visible, not through the thickening fog. The group froze, their hearts pounding in unison. One by one, figures began to emerge from the mist, their movements slow and deliberate, yet not quite human. These were the same figures they had seen earlier on the mountain, their faces still obscured, their limbs twisted in unnatural angles. The figures didn't speak, they didn't need to. As they closed in, the air grew thick, oppressive. It was as if the fog had taken on a life of its own, filling the cabin, pressing against the walls and suffocating the air. "Run!" Alex yelled, his voice desperate. But there was no running. No matter which direction they turned, the fog followed them, closing in tighter with every step. The figures seemed to be everywhere, surrounding them in all directions, yet none of them were ever truly seen, only sensed. The group stumbled in the suffocating haze, unsure whether they were even going in the right direction. Everything had become distorted. The trees, once familiar, now appeared twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and tilt, making every step feel like it could be their last. "I can't breathe," Sarah gasped, her hand clutching her chest, her voice breaking. The fog had grown so thick it was as if the very air had turned solid, suffocating them from all sides. Ethan's vision blurred, his mind reeling with the same terrifying realization that had gripped him earlier. The mountain was not just a place, it was a force, an ancient entity that lived and breathed. And it was using them, luring them deeper into its dark heart. They were no longer merely hikers, they had become part of the mountain's story, its offering to the mist. They were not the first to disappear. Ethan turned, a wild look in his eyes. "We need to find a way to break the cycle. We have to." But as his words left his mouth, The ground beneath them cracked, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very earth. The fog parted, revealing a jagged cliff edge. Beyond it, the endless expanse of the mountain stretched upward, disappearing into an endless dark sky. "No," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't real. None of this is real." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The mist, the figures, the whispering voices, they were all part of something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for them. Something that had been watching and waiting for the right moment to claim them. The figures, those twisted shapes, began to close in, their movements steady, relentless. Their faces remained hidden, but their eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly as if they were alive with an unnatural hunger. The group backed away slowly, terror gripping their hearts. Suddenly, a voice broke through the stillness, clear and cold. "Your names will join ours." Ethan felt a chill run through his body. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mountain's mist, its ancient force, had spoken. And in that moment, Ethan knew that their fate had been sealed the moment they set foot on its cursed soil. There was no escape now. The fog grew thicker, and as it swirled around them, the figures moved in for the final time. They reached out, not with hands but with the cold, suffocating air that surrounded them. The last thing Ethan saw before the mist swallowed him whole was the look in Alex's eyes, the desperate, hopeless realization that they were not in control. And as the fog continued to swirl, the mountain once again claimed its prize, adding the names of Alex, Sarah, Ethan, and the others to the long list of lost souls who had dared to challenge its forgotten ancient power. Somewhere deep in the mountain, their voices could still be heard, carried on the wind, a whisper, a warning to those who might one day come seeking what the mist hides. But for now the mountain was silent once more. The fog had swallowed them whole, leaving only silence in its wake. 4 days no one came looking for the hikers, and the mountain stood untouched, a timeless sentinel in the frozen wilderness. The cabin, now forgotten and decaying, was soon reclaimed by the snow and wind, its walls crumbling into nothingness. The stone altar too was slowly buried, just another secret of the mountain hidden beneath layers of snow. But the mountain was not done. It never truly was. Months passed, and the mystery of the hikers' disappearance faded from the minds of those who lived in the nearby village. They had heard rumors, strange sightings, whispers of ghostly figures in the fog, but no one dared venture near the peak of the mountain. The villagers had learned long ago that some places were better left undisturbed. The mountain's reputation was enough to keep them at bay, as it had done for generations. Yet every so often someone would pass through the village, a lone traveler, a curious soul, seeking the kind of thrill that only the untamed wilderness could offer. One such traveler was Henry, an experienced mountaineer with a reputation for conquering the most challenging terrains. His interest in the unexplained led him to the stories of the mist, and against all warnings, he made the decision to climb the mountain alone. He arrived at the village late in the evening, his breath visible in the sharp cold, the snow crunching underfoot as he walked into the local tavern. The villagers eyed him warily but said nothing, knowing better than to stop someone who had made up their mind. He ordered a drink and sat by the fire, overhearing bits of conversation about the lost hikers. He smiled to himself, convinced it was just another tale to make the mountain seem more dangerous than it really was. That night he slept fitfully, the wind howling outside, but the pull of the mountain was too strong. By dawn he had packed his gear and was on his way. The climb was difficult, but Henry was no stranger to hardship. He pushed forward, eager to discover the truth behind the mysterious fog that had consumed so many before him. Hours turned into days, and the higher he climbed, the colder the air became. Soon, the world below him was lost to the thickening fog, and the mountain seemed to close in around him, a suffocating pressure that made every step feel like a battle. On the 3rd day the fog began to thicken. The air grew heavier, as though it carried something unseen, something ancient. Henry stopped to rest, his breath coming in short gasps. It was then that he heard it, a faint sound in the distance. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He turned, expecting to see another climber, but there was no one. The sound of footsteps persisted, echoing around him, growing louder. And then, from the swirling mist, figures began to emerge, twisted shapes, their faces hidden beneath shadowed hoods, their movements unnatural, jerky. Henry's heart raced. He had read the stories, of course, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. He reached for his radio, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. The figures began to circle him, their silent presence closing in. Henry's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were anchored to the ground by some unseen force. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice shaking. The figures didn't answer. They didn't need to. A sharp gust of wind ripped through the clearing, and as Henry shielded his eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing at the center of the group was a figure taller than the rest, its face illuminated by the pale glow of the mist. The figure's eyes, empty, hollow, locked onto his. "Your name will join ours," the figure whispered, its voice a cold, hollow sound that seemed to reverberate through the air itself. The fog thickened, and Henry felt his vision blur. The world around him began to distort, the mountainside warping as though it was no longer a part of reality. The ground shifted beneath his feet, and the figures moved closer, their hands outstretched. Suddenly Henry's mind flashed to the journal, the names of the lost hikers, their fates sealed by the mountain. He understood then, too late, that the mountain wasn't just claiming lives. It was keeping them, trapping them in the mist, their souls woven into the fog itself. Desperately Henry tried to run, but his legs refused to obey. The mist closed in around him, and with one final desperate cry, he was pulled into the darkness. Weeks later, a group of hikers stumbled across Henry's abandoned campsite. His equipment was still there, his backpack undisturbed, but there was no sign of him. They found nothing but a few scattered items and a journal, its pages filled with strange symbols. They read the last entry: "The mountain claims us all. I am no longer alone." The fog remained as it always had, swirling around the summit, hiding the secrets it had kept for centuries. And in the silence that followed, the mountain stood, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to seek its secrets. For those who venture too close, the mist will always be there, ready to claim them, to add their names to the mountain's unending list of lost souls. The summit will never be reached. The fog will never dissipate. And the mountain will always hunger for more.